My name is Elena Rostova, and I was 32 the year my older sister and her husband decided my life's work was nothing more than overgrown landscaping they could bulldoze to build a luxury resort. They waited until the ink on our father's last will and testament was barely dry to slide a property waiver across a marble kitchen island, smiling with the predatory warmth of people who believe they have just legally stolen a multi-million-dollar piece of real estate. My brother-in-law would later stand in the middle of a dusty, sun-baked orchard screaming at a federal agricultural inspector, his face red with a desperate, sweaty panic. He genuinely believed he was a master real estate developer who had executed the perfect land grab. He had absolutely no idea that when I handed him the title to those 200 acres of prime valley soil, I wasn't handing him a blank canvas. I was handing him a federally protected, strictly regulated biological minefield that he was legally forbidden to touch. Welcome back to Whispered Drama Stories, where we tell quiet, true-to-life stories about boundaries, dignity, and the moment someone finally stops shrinking to fit a family narrative they never wrote. If a calm woman with a soil pH meter, a flawless understanding of botanical patent law, and an airtight legal trap is your idea of justice, you are in the right place. People fundamentally misunderstand what an agricultural geneticist and pomologist does. Pomology is the branch of botany that focuses on the cultivation and science of fruit. Civilians think my job is simply planting seeds, watering dirt, and watching things grow. They think it is a quaint, romantic hobby. It isn't. True agricultural science is the mastery of cellular biology, drought-resistant sequencing, and intellectual property law. When you breed a new, stable hybrid of a fruit-bearing tree, one that can withstand extreme heat or resist a specific blight, you aren't just growing a plant. You are engineering a proprietary biological asset. And in the United States, if you stabilize that hybrid, you can patent it under the Plant Variety Protection Act. You own the genetic code of that tree, and anyone who propagates, sells, or destroys it without your licensing permission commits a massive federal offense. I built my entire life on the principle of deep roots and microscopic cellular precision. I trusted the soil. I trusted genetics. I trusted the undeniable reality that if you cultivate a strong foundation, the yield will eventually prove your worth. Unfortunately, I was raised in a family that treated the earth like cheap, mass-produced concrete, valuable only for what you could pave over it, and entirely disposable the moment a better offer came along. In my family, there was my older sister Victoria, and there was me. Victoria was 36, aggressively ambitious, and entirely obsessed with the aesthetic of wealth. She was a corporate real estate broker who spoke entirely in buzzwords like synergy, zoning leverage, and liquidity events. Her husband, Greg, was a commercial developer who viewed every open field as a personal insult until he could pour asphalt over it. My father, Marcus, was a third-generation farmer, but he wasn't a scientist. Marcus was a stubborn, old-school man who believed that real farming meant driving a tractor and breaking your back in the sun. He grew standard, low-margin crops, corn and soybeans, and struggled to keep the family's sprawling 200-acre valley farm out of the red. To my father and my sister, my career in fruit science was an absolute mystery, and therefore, it was a disappointment. I had no interest in growing commodity corn. I had spent 8 grueling years earning my doctorate in pomology and agricultural genetics. I specialized in arid climate cultivation, breeding stone fruit and apple hybrids that could produce massive, high-sugar yields in severely drought-stricken environments. It was highly specialized, vital work for a changing global climate. When I finished my doctorate, I didn't take a corporate job with a massive agrochemical company. I came back to the family farm. I leased 50 acres of the most barren, rocky, unusable soil on the far edge of my father's property. He laughed when I signed the internal lease agreement. He told me I was wasting my time trying to grow fruit in dead dirt. I didn't argue with him. I built a state-of-the-art climate-controlled research greenhouse on a small 2-acre adjoining parcel. And then, I planted my proprietary experimental rootstocks in those 50 acres of dead dirt. For 7 years, I worked in complete silence. While Victoria and Greg were attending country club galas and flipping commercial real estate in the city, I was in the dirt. I cross-pollinated, I grafted, I meticulously documented the genetic stability of my hybrids. By my 32nd birthday, the dead dirt was a thriving, lush, high-density orchard. My drought-resistant hybrid, which I had officially named the Rostova Crimson, was a massive success. The fruit was incredible, the trees required a fraction of the standard water usage, and I had officially secured the federal plant breeder's rights and biological patent for the genetic lineage. I was quietly negotiating exclusive, multi-million-dollar licensing contracts with massive commercial growers in California and Europe. But I didn't tell my family about the patents. I didn't tell them about the licensing money. They didn't ask, and I had learned long ago that sharing my successes with Victoria only resulted in her mocking me for getting excited about a fancy apple. The fragile, polite distance in our family shattered the winter my father suddenly passed away from a massive cardiac arrest. The grief was heavy, complicated, and exhausting. I spent weeks organizing the funeral, contacting the local agricultural co-ops, and handling the logistics of the farm, while Victoria and Greg flew in from the city, staying at a luxury hotel because the old farmhouse was too depressing. But the moment the dirt was tossed onto our father's casket, Victoria's overwhelming grief evaporated, instantly replaced by a predatory, laser-focused obsession with his estate. Marcus was land-rich but cash-poor. The 200 acres of the family farm were appraised at roughly $8 million, primarily because the city suburbs were rapidly expanding toward our valley. The land was prime for commercial development. When the lawyer read the will in his stuffy downtown office, my father's final archaic patriarchal bias was laid bare. Marcus left the massive, 200-acre primary farm entirely to Victoria. To me, his gardener daughter, he left the small 2-acre parcel containing my research greenhouse and the old, dilapidated farmhouse. He didn't mention the 50 acres of my orchard, because under property law, those trees were physically planted on the primary 200-acre parcel. Because my internal lease with my father had expired the year prior, and I had been operating on a month-to-month handshake agreement with him, the physical land under my orchard formally transferred to Victoria. Victoria and Greg didn't even try to hide their absolute, ecstatic triumph. They sat in the lawyer's office, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. "Well," Victoria sighed, adjusting her designer sunglasses, "it's a lot of responsibility, but Greg and I are prepared to manage the estate. We'll probably just liquidate the acreage. Farming is a dead industry anyway." I sat quietly in my chair. I didn't yell. I didn't cry about the unfairness of the will. I am a scientist. I observe the variables, and I adjust the hypothesis. 2 weeks later, the storm finally rolled into my quiet, sterile greenhouse. I was sitting at my stainless steel workbench, wearing my reading glasses, meticulously cataloging a batch of hybrid seeds. The heavy glass door of the greenhouse swung open. Victoria and Greg walked in. They didn't look like grieving family members. They looked like corporate sharks touring an acquisition. Greg was wearing an expensive suit, holding a leather portfolio. Victoria was wearing high heels, visibly disgusted by the damp, earthy smell of the greenhouse. "Elena?" Victoria said, waving a hand in front of her face as if clearing a bad odor. "We need to have a business meeting. Can you put the little seeds down for 5 minutes?" I carefully capped my specimen vial, removed my glasses, and looked at them. "What can I do for you, Victoria?" Greg stepped forward, taking the lead with the aggressive, booming confidence of a man who assumes he is the smartest person in the room. He dropped the leather portfolio onto my clean workbench. "I'll get right to the point, Elena," Greg said smoothly. "Victoria and I have been moving fast on the estate. We've secured a buyer for the 200 acres. A massive luxury hospitality developer wants to buy the entire valley to build a high-end eco-resort and golf course. The offer is staggering, $22 million. I didn't flinch. "Congratulations. That's a very lucrative deal." "It is," Victoria beamed, unable to hide her greed. "But there's a small administrative hurdle. The developers need a completely clean, unencumbered title. They're going to bulldoze the entire 200 acres to grade the land for the golf course. That includes that patch of rocky dirt where you planted your little experimental trees. My orchard. I corrected her quietly. Right, the orchard, Greg said dismissively. The problem is, because you had a historical lease with Marcus on those 50 acres, the title insurance company is flagging a potential tenant dispute risk. They won't clear the $22 million sale unless you formally, legally, sign away any claim to the property or the vegetation on it. Victoria leaned against the workbench, adopting her most patronizing maternal tone. We know you put a lot of time into planting those trees, Elena. It's a cute hobby, but you have to be realistic. This is a $22 million commercial real estate deal. You can't hold up a massive corporate acquisition over some apples. So, Greg had his lawyers draft up a solution, Victoria continued, gesturing to the portfolio. Greg opened the leather folder and slid a thick, freshly printed legal document across the stainless steel. It was a quitclaim deed and total release of interest. It's very generous, Elena, Greg said, tapping his expensive pen against the paper. If you sign this deed, you formally waive any and all rights to the 200 acres, including all physical fixtures, structures, and vegetation planted on the land. In exchange, Victoria and I will personally cut you a check for $100,000. I stared at the paper. They were offering me $100,000 to walk away from an orchard that contained 7 years of my life's work. They were offering me a fraction of a penny on the dollar to allow a developer to drive a bulldozer over thousands of proprietary, genetically priceless Rostova Crimson hybrids. They thought my life's work was just landscaping. You want me to sign over the orchard so you can destroy it, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. We are giving you $100,000 for a bunch of firewood, Elena, Greg snapped, his temper flaring at my perceived hesitation. You can take that money, buy a bigger greenhouse, and play with your seeds all day long, but you are not going to hold our inheritance hostage. If you don't sign this, I will have my lawyers drag you through eviction court. I will bury you in legal fees until you have to sell this little 2-acre parcel just to pay your bills. It's the smart play, Elena, Victoria pushed, her eyes narrowing. Don't be stubborn. You always were too emotionally attached to the dirt. Take the money. Sign the paper. I sat in my ergonomic chair. I looked at the quitclaim deed. I am a master agricultural geneticist. I do not panic when a pest introduces itself into my ecosystem. I put the leaf under a microscope. I identify the vulnerability, and I apply the precise, targeted eradication method. I read the legal document Greg's expensive corporate lawyers had drafted. It was absolutely ruthless regarding the real property. It stated that I surrendered all rights to the physical land, the soil, the water rights, and the physical wood and leaves of the trees. But Greg was a real estate developer. His lawyers were real estate lawyers. They understood zoning. They understood title insurance. They did not understand the Plant Variety Protection Act. They did not understand the United States Department of Agriculture's stringent intellectual property regulations. The document explicitly transferred the physical vegetation to Victoria. It did not contain a single clause regarding the transfer of biological patents, genetic licensing, or plant breeders' rights. They were demanding ownership of the physical trees, completely unaware that the DNA inside those trees belonged exclusively to me. If I sign this, I said softly, looking up at my brother-in-law, the physical trees on those 50 acres become the sole unencumbered property of your holding company. I will have no physical claim to the orchard. Exactly, Greg said, his chest puffing out with arrogant triumph. A clean break. You take the $100,000, we take the land, and the bulldozers roll in next month. I didn't cry. I didn't beg them to save my life's work. I picked up the expensive pen Greg had placed on the table. I think $100,000 is a very fair price for your peace of mind, Greg, I said smoothly. I signed my name on the execution line. I initialed every page of the release. I pushed the signed, legally binding deed across the stainless steel table. Victoria practically snatched the paper off the table. A massive, victorious smile spread across her face. She had done it. She had crushed her quiet, weird little sister and secured her $22 million payday. I knew you'd eventually see reason, Elena, Victoria gloated, sliding the deed into the leather portfolio. Greg will have the 100,000 wired to your account by the end of the week. Make sure you have all your little gardening tools out of the orchard by the end of the month. The developers want to clear-cut the lot immediately. I will stay entirely off your property, Victoria. I promised, my voice as calm and cool as the climate control system humming above our heads. They walked out of my greenhouse, their laughter echoing across the gravel driveway as they got into Greg's leased European sports car and sped away. I stood alone in the quiet, sterile sanctuary of my research facility. They thought they had just bought a clear title to an empty field. They believed they were the smartest people in the room because they only looked at the surface acreage. They had absolutely no idea that by forcing me to sign that specific legal waiver, they had just formally assumed liability for a highly restricted, federally patented biological asset. They had just chained themselves to a mountain of agricultural intellectual property law, and they were about to drown in it. I didn't yell. I didn't throw my seed vials at the wall. I walked over to my desk, opened my laptop, and drafted a very specific, heavily documented email to the regional director of the USDA's Plant Variety Protection Office. To a civilian, there is no difference between dirt and soil. They look at the ground and see a uniform, brown surface. But to an agricultural geneticist, dirt is just dead particulate matter. Soil is a living, breathing, microscopic ecosystem. It is a complex matrix of fungi, microbial bacteria, nitrogen, and carefully balanced pH levels that takes decades to cultivate and only hours to destroy. Greg and Victoria looked at my 50-acre orchard and saw dirt. They saw a flat surface waiting to be graded for the 9th hole of a luxury golf course. They did not understand that the 2,000 Rostova crimson trees planted in that soil were not just wood and leaves. Under the strict, unforgiving jurisdiction of the United States Department of Agriculture and the Plant Variety Protection Office, PVPAO, those trees were classified as highly restricted proprietary biological technology. When you hold a federal biological patent on a unique plant hybrid, the law grants you absolute microscopic sovereignty over that genetic code. No one can propagate it, sell it, transport it, or possess it without a heavily vetted, fiercely expensive licensing agreement. And crucially, because agricultural intellectual property theft is a multi-billion-dollar global issue, the federal government does not take the unauthorized possession of patented germplasm lightly. If an unauthorized entity suddenly comes into physical possession of a patented commercial crop, the USDA treats it with the exact same legal severity as someone coming into unauthorized possession of stolen pharmaceuticals or classified software. When Greg and Victoria forced me to sign that quitclaim deed, demanding that I surrender all physical vegetation to their holding company, they thought they were just clearing a title. They had absolutely no idea that in the eyes of federal agricultural law, they had just formally, legally documented their unauthorized acquisition of 2,000 units of restricted biological technology. I didn't try to stop the $100,000 wire transfer. In fact, I welcomed it. When the funds cleared my independent business account on Thursday morning, I used Greg's money to immediately upgrade the perimeter security of my remaining 2-acre research facility. I hired a specialized agricultural fencing contractor to install an 8-foot steel mesh biological containment fence around my greenhouse and the original, primary mother stock of the Rostova crimson. I installed high-definition security cameras. I wanted absolute, undeniable proof that my 2 acres were entirely separate from the impending disaster next door. I then spent the weekend in my climate-controlled office, organizing my legal arsenal. I compiled my federal PVPA certificates, the approved patent schematics mapping the exact genetic markers of the Rostova crimson, and a certified copy of the quitclaim deed that Greg had proudly emailed me as proof of eviction. I sent the entire dossier to Dr. Eris Thorne, a senior federal inspector for the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, APHIS, who operated out of the regional field office. I had worked with Dr. Thorne for years during the patent approval process. He was a stern, incredibly meticulous scientist who despised corporate developers who flouted agricultural protocols. My email to him was not a frantic plea for help. It was a formal, clinical report of an intellectual property breach. Dear Dr. Thorne, I wrote, I am formally notifying APHIS that my proprietary PVPA patented biological assets, Rostova Crimson, patent number 8849201, located on Sector 4 of the Valley acreage, have been physically acquired by an unauthorized, unlicensed commercial holding company. The holding company intends to bulldoze the site next week. I am requesting an immediate federal injunction to prevent the unauthorized destruction or unmonitored transportation of my patented genetic material. Dr. Thorne replied exactly 14 minutes later. Dr. Rostova, receipt acknowledged. The unauthorized acquisition of restricted germplasm is a Level 1 federal violation. A field team will be dispatched to secure the biological assets. I closed my laptop. The trap wasn't just set. The jaws had already snapped shut. Greg and Victoria just hadn't felt the steel bite into their ankles yet. The following Wednesday was the day Greg had scheduled the clear-cutting. The luxury hospitality developers who had purchased the $22 million estate were eager to break ground. Greg, acting as the managing broker for the sale, wanted to personally oversee the demolition of my orchard to prove to the buyers that the site was completely clean and ready for the golf course grading. At 8 a.m., the heavy machinery arrived. I stood inside my secure, climate-controlled greenhouse, sipping a cup of black coffee, looking out through the reinforced glass. Down in the valley, just beyond my new steel perimeter fence, a fleet of massive yellow industrial bulldozers and wood chippers rolled off their flatbed trailers. The diesel engines roared, sending thick plumes of black exhaust into the pristine morning air. Greg's leased luxury SUV pulled up to the edge of the orchard, kicking up a cloud of dry dust. He stepped out, wearing a tailored suit, an expensive hard hat, and a pair of reflective aviator sunglasses. He looked like a man who believed he was the master of the universe, ready to conquer the earth with a flick of his wrist. Victoria stepped out of the passenger side, holding a clipboard, flanked by two men in equally expensive suits, the corporate lawyers representing the luxury resort developers. They stood at the edge of my 50-acre orchard. The Rostova crimson trees were in full, beautiful bloom, their branches heavy with the promise of high-yield, drought-resistant fruit. It was 7 years of brilliant, painstaking cellular biology, and Greg was pointing at them, signaling the lead bulldozer operator to rev his engine and flatten the first row. The bulldozer's massive steel blade lowered to the dirt. The treads began to churn. I took a slow sip of my coffee. Just as the bulldozer lurched forward, a convoy of 4 pristine, white government SUVs crested the valley ridge. They were moving incredibly fast. They didn't use sirens, but the flashing amber and blue strobe lights in their grills commanded absolute authority. The white SUVs swerved off the main access road, kicking up a massive wall of dust as they aggressively boxed in the bulldozer, forcing the operator to slam on his brakes. Greg spun around, his arrogant smile vanishing instantly. He ripped off his sunglasses, glaring at the vehicles. "What the hell is this?" Greg yelled over the idle of the diesel engines, waving his arms at the SUVs. "This is a private, closed commercial worksite. You need to move those vehicles immediately." The doors of the lead SUV opened. Dr. Aris Thorne stepped out. He was not wearing a suit. He was wearing a tactical field jacket bearing the federal seal of the United States Department of Agriculture, thick boots, and an expression of absolute, unyielding federal authority. He was flanked by 3 armed federal agricultural enforcement agents. Dr. Thorne didn't yell. He didn't wave his arms. He simply walked up to the bulldozer, held up his federal badge, and signaled the operator to cut the engine. The deafening roar of the heavy machinery died, leaving the valley in a tense, ringing silence. "Who is the managing director of this holding company?" Dr. Thorne asked, his voice carrying the sharp, clinical weight of a man who can shut down an entire state's supply chain with a single signature. Greg marched forward, his chest puffed out, flanked by the developer's high-priced corporate lawyers. "I am Greg Vance, the managing director," Greg barked, trying to reclaim his authority. "And I don't care what local zoning board you're from. We have all the municipal permits to clear this land. We have a $22 million closing scheduled for Friday. You are trespassing on private property." Dr. Thorne looked at Greg with the kind of profound, exhausted pity a scientist reserves for an incredibly loud, incredibly ignorant lab rat. "I am not from the Municipal Zoning Board, Mr. Vance," Dr. Thorne said smoothly, pulling a thick clipboard from under his arm. "I am a federal inspector with the USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, and you are not currently standing on a commercial construction site. You are standing in the middle of an unauthorized biological holding zone." Greg frowned, the buzzwords failing to process in his real estate-oriented brain. "Biological holding zone? What are you talking about? It's a field of dead apple trees." "They are not apples, Mr. Vance," Dr. Thorne corrected him, his voice dropping into a cold, lethal register. "They are prunus hybrids, specifically the Rostova crimson. They are a highly restricted, federally patented biological asset protected under the Plant Variety Protection Act." The developer's corporate lawyers, who were entirely familiar with intellectual property risk, suddenly stopped looking annoyed and started looking incredibly nervous. One of them stepped forward. "Inspector," the lawyer said carefully, "this land and all physical vegetation on it was legally acquired by Mr. Vance's holding company via a signed quitclaim deed from the previous tenant. We have the title free and clear." "I am aware of the quitclaim deed, Dr. Thorne replied, pulling a copy of the very document Greg had forced me to sign out of his clipboard. "In fact, this deed is the specific reason you are facing federal sanctions today." Greg's face turned the color of wet cement. "What? You forced the patent holder, Dr. Elena Rostova, to surrender the physical ownership of these trees to your holding company," Dr. Thorne explained, tapping the paper. "But you did not purchase the biological licensing rights. You acquired the physical wood, but you do not own the genetic code inside the wood." "So what?" Greg yelled, panic beginning to bleed into his arrogance. "I own the physical trees. I can bulldoze my own physical trees. I'm not trying to steal her genetics, I'm trying to turn them into mulch." "You cannot do that, Mr. Vance," Dr. Thorne stated, completely unfazed by Greg's volume. "Under federal agricultural law, destroying a patented biological asset without the explicit, documented supervision of the USDA and the written consent of the patent holder is a federal crime. It is considered the destruction of restricted intellectual property and evidence spoliation." Victoria, who had been standing silently in shock, finally found her voice. "That is insane. We own the land. We can clear it. Furthermore," Dr. Thorne continued, entirely ignoring my sister, "because your holding company is now the documented physical owner of 2,000 units of unlicensed restricted germplasm, you are in direct violation of the PVPA. You are not authorized to possess this biological material." "Then take them," Greg shouted, gesturing wildly at the orchard. "Dig them up, take the trees, I don't want them." "I cannot take them," Dr. Thorne said smoothly. "The federal government does not offer free landscaping removal services for corporate developers who violate IP laws. These trees are currently in a state of legal quarantine. They cannot be sold, they cannot be moved, and they absolutely cannot be bulldozed." The lead developer's lawyer, a man whose hourly billing rate was likely higher than my monthly grocery budget, stepped directly in front of Greg. He looked at the federal inspector, his face pale. "Inspector Thorne?" the lawyer asked, his voice tight. "What is the legal status of this 200-acre parcel right now?" "As of 8 a.m. this morning," Dr. Thorne announced, his voice echoing across the quiet, sun-baked valley, "this entire 200-acre parcel is under a hard federal agricultural injunction. No heavy machinery may operate on the soil. No vegetation may be altered. The property cannot be legally sold, transferred, or developed until the holding company resolves the unauthorized possession of the biological assets and submits to a comprehensive USDA audit." The developer's lawyer didn't argue. He didn't threaten to call a judge. He was a corporate risk manager, and he knew a radioactive, completely toxic legal nightmare when he saw one. A federal biological injunction wasn't a municipal zoning delay you could bribe your way out of. It was a multi-year, multi-million-dollar federal freeze. The lawyer turned slowly to look at Greg. The look in his eyes was absolute, unmitigated corporate fury. "You told us the title was clean, Greg," the lawyer hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "You swore the site was clear for grading." "It is clear," Greg pleaded, sweat pouring down his face, completely abandoning his tough guy persona. "It's just a misunderstanding. We can fix this. Give me 24 hours. The deal is dead, Greg," the lawyer stated flatly. He didn't even raise his voice. It was an execution. "My clients are not buying a federally quarantined biological hazard site. We are pulling the $22 million from escrow immediately and expect a lawsuit from my firm for breach of contract and misrepresentation of assets by the end of the week." The lawyer turned on his heel, signaled his associate, and walked briskly back to their luxury SUV. They got in and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled slowly over Greg and Victoria. Greg stood in the dirt, completely paralyzed. The $22 million luxury resort deal, the golf course, his massive broker commission. It had all evaporated into thin air in less than 5 minutes. Victoria let out a high-pitched, hysterical sob. She dropped her clipboard in the dirt. "Greg," she wept, grabbing his arm. "Greg, what do we do? We leveraged the estate to pay for the zoning permits. We don't have the cash to hold this property." Greg didn't look at her. He looked past the federal SUVs. He looked past the quiet, idling bulldozers. He looked up the gentle slope of the valley, directly toward the 8-foot steel mesh fence of my 2-acre research facility. Through the reinforced glass of the greenhouse, I watched him. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I stood perfectly still, holding my coffee mug, projecting the cold, absolute detachment of a scientist observing a failed biological specimen. Greg realized in that exact moment that I hadn't just signed his piece of paper. I had let him walk blindly into a federal minefield, and I had handed him the detonator. He broke into a run. He sprinted up the dusty slope, his expensive dress shoes slipping on the loose rocks, his suit jacket flapping wildly behind him. He reached the heavy steel mesh fence surrounding my property. He grabbed the chain link with both hands, shaking it, panting heavily, his face purple with rage and terror. "Elena!" Greg screamed, his voice echoing frantically across the valley. "Elena, get out here. You set us up. You call off these feds right now." I set my coffee mug down on the stainless steel workbench. I pressed the button to activate the exterior intercom system mounted on the greenhouse wall. My voice, amplified and perfectly calm, rolled out over the valley. "I cannot call them off, Greg," I said smoothly. "I am merely the patent holder. You are the one who demanded physical possession of 2,000 units of highly restricted, federally protected agricultural technology. I simply notified the authorities that an unlicensed developer was in possession of my intellectual property." "You tricked us!" Greg roared, rattling the heavy steel fence looking like a caged animal. "You knew we couldn't bulldoze the trees if we owned them. You knew." "I am a pomologist, Greg," I replied through the intercom. "I understand the law regarding my assets. You are a real estate developer. You assumed that because my work was planted in the dirt, it was just landscaping. You priced my life's work at $100,000. I simply accepted your valuation and allowed the federal government to explain the actual cost." "Elena, please." Victoria's voice carried up the hill. She was stumbling up the slope behind him, crying, her high heels completely ruined by the rocky soil. "Elena, they killed the deal. The buyers walked away. You have to lift the patent. You have to let us clear the land." "I don't have to do anything, Victoria," I said, my voice dropping the polite facade, hardening into the cold, unforgiving reality of a scientist enforcing a boundary. "You made your play. You stole the farm, and you tried to extort me out of my orchard. You thought you were the smartest people in the room because you only looked at the surface. Well, now you own the surface. Enjoy the dirt." I switched the intercom off. I turned my back on the window, walked over to my sterile workstation, and picked up my seed catalogs. Outside, the heavy yellow bulldozers were already backing onto their flatbed trailers to leave, ordered off the property by the armed federal agents. Greg and Victoria were trapped. They owned 200 acres of prime real estate that they legally could not touch, sell, or develop. And the meter on their destruction had only just begun to run. The silence that followed the departure of the heavy machinery was not peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a financial vacuum. From the safety of my 2-acre federally fenced sanctuary, I watched the absolute, slow-motion destruction of Greg and Victoria's lives play out over the next 6 months. Real estate developers operate on a very specific high-stress timeline. They leverage massive amounts of debt to hold property, banking entirely on a swift, profitable liquidity event to pay off the interest. When Dr. Thorne slapped the 200-acre estate with a federal agricultural injunction, he didn't just stop the bulldozers, he stopped the clock on Greg's liquidity, while the meter on his debt continued to run at a terrifying speed. The consequences of possessing 2,000 units of unauthorized, restricted germplasm were swift and unimaginably expensive. Because the Rostova crimson trees were now technically biological evidence in a federal intellectual property investigation, the USDA required them to be maintained in a state of absolute living stasis. Greg could not destroy them. But worse, he could not neglect them. 2 weeks after the failed clear-cutting, Greg received a certified mandate from APHIS as the documented physical owner of the quarantined biological assets. His holding company was legally required to provide adequate water, pest control, and soil maintenance to keep the trees alive until the federal audit was complete. If a single patented tree died due to neglect while in his unauthorized possession, he would be heavily fined for the spoliation of restricted federal evidence. Greg, a man who didn't know the difference between a fungicide and a fertilizer, was forced to hire a highly specialized, incredibly expensive agricultural management firm just to keep the orchard alive. He was paying tens of thousands of dollars a month to water the very trees he had tried to turn into mulch. But the maintenance fees were just the beginning of the hemorrhage. The luxury resort developers were furious. They had wasted millions of dollars on architectural plans, zoning permits, and environmental impact studies for a site that Greg had explicitly promised was clear and unencumbered. When the deal collapsed, they didn't just walk away. They sued Greg's holding company for $5 million in damages for fraudulent misrepresentation of assets. Because Greg was facing a massive, multi-million-dollar corporate lawsuit, his commercial credit lines froze instantly. His other development projects in the city stalled. The banks, smelling blood in the water, began calling in his notes. Victoria's life unraveled with equal, humiliating speed. As the broker on the failed $22 million deal, her reputation in the corporate real estate world was entirely incinerated. The industry thrives on discretion and competence. Victoria had delivered a federally quarantined biological hazard site to a major buyer. She was quietly let go from her prestigious brokerage firm. She lost her country club membership. The aesthetic of wealth she had spent her entire life cultivating crumbled into a desperate, frantic scramble to hide from their creditors. I, however, spent those 6 months in absolute peace. I finalized the licensing agreements for the Rostova Crimson Genetics with 2 massive agricultural conglomerates in California and Spain. Because my holding company, the entity that owned the patents, was completely legally isolated from my father's estate, the federal injunction on the physical valley did not affect my intellectual property revenue. I received a massive, 7-figure upfront licensing fee, with guaranteed residual royalties on every acre of fruit planted using my genetics over the next 20 years. I was financially secure beyond my wildest dreams, doing exactly what I loved within the quiet sanctuary of my greenhouse. Winter arrived, blanketing the valley in a quiet, dormant frost. It was mid-January when the breaking point finally occurred. I was at my stainless steel workbench, analyzing a cross-section of a dormant scion under my microscope, when my secure gate intercom buzzed. I tapped the monitor. Standing outside the 8-foot steel mesh perimeter fence, shivering in the freezing wind, were Victoria and Greg. They didn't look like corporate conquerors anymore. Greg looked like he had aged 10 years in 6 months. His hair was thinning, his face was drawn, and he was wearing a simple, off-the-rack winter coat instead of his custom Italian wool overcoats. Victoria looked exhausted. Her posture slumped, devoid of the arrogant, high-heeled strut that had defined her entire existence. I pressed the intercom button. "Yes, Elena." Victoria's voice crackled through the speaker. It was small. It was broken. "Please, we need to talk to you. Let us in." I looked at the monitor. I didn't feel a shred of pity, but I knew that a biological system must eventually reach equilibrium. The parasite had starved. It was time to clear the host. I buzzed the gate open and met them at the door of my greenhouse. I didn't invite them into my sterile workspace. We stood in the small, climate-controlled mudroom at the entrance. "What can I do for you?" I asked, my voice polite, clinical, and entirely detached. Greg couldn't even make eye contact with me. He stared at the concrete floor, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. It was Victoria who spoke, tears welling up in her eyes, finally dropping the mask she had worn her entire life. "We are bankrupt, Elena," Victoria whispered, the words sounding like sandpaper in her throat. "The developer's lawsuit, the legal fees, the USDA fines. It drained everything. We had to sell our house in the city. Greg's company is in Chapter 11. We have absolutely nothing left except this farm. And you cannot sell the farm," I stated smoothly. "We can't sell it. We can't leverage it. We can't do anything," Greg finally burst out, a ragged, pathetic edge to his voice. "The USDA won't lift the biological quarantine until the ownership of the restricted germplasm is resolved. They said the only way to clear the federal injunction is if the patent holder, you, formally reacquires the physical assets. I am aware of the PVPA resolution protocols," I said. "Elena, the bank is going to foreclose on the 200 acres at the end of the month," Victoria sobbed, reaching out as if to touch my arm, but stopping when I took a deliberate step back. "If it goes into foreclosure with a federal injunction on it, we will be personally liable for the remaining multi-million-dollar deficit. We will go to federal prison for the USDA fines. You have to take the trees back. Please. We are begging you. Just sign a waiver reclaiming the physical orchard so the feds will lift the hold." I looked at my older sister. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life treating my passion as a dirty, embarrassing hobby. I looked at the man who had threatened to drag me through eviction court and destroy my life's work over a corporate payday. They had brought a bulldozer to a garden, and they had expected the earth to simply roll over and die. "I am not going to sign a waiver to reclaim the 50-acre orchard, Victoria," I said, my voice completely flat. Victoria gasped, covering her mouth with her hand, a look of absolute, unmitigated terror washing over her face. Greg squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a low, agonizing groan of defeat. "They thought I was going to let them burn. I am not going to take just the 50 acres, I continued, letting the silence stretch for a long, heavy second. "Because I don't want you as my neighbors. I don't want to look out of my greenhouse and see you on the horizon." Greg's head snapped up. "What are you saying?" I walked over to a small filing cabinet near the door. I pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila folder and placed it on a small utility table. "I am an agricultural scientist," I said smoothly. "I understand that a diseased crop cannot be partially salvaged. You have to remove the entire infection to save the soil. So, I had my corporate attorneys draft a solution." I opened the folder. Inside was a document that looked incredibly familiar. "This is a quitclaim deed and total release of interest," I explained, echoing the exact phrasing Greg had used on me 6 months ago. "If you sign this deed, you formally waive any and all rights to the entire 200-acre estate, the physical land, the farmhouse, the water rights, and all physical vegetation transfer completely to my holding company." Greg stared at the paper, his mouth hanging open. You want the whole farm?" "In exchange," I continued, tapping my expensive pen against the paper, "my holding company will formally assume all physical liability for the patented biological assets, which will immediately satisfy the USDA and lift the federal quarantine. Furthermore, I will personally cut you a check for $100,000. You can use that money to pay off the developer's lawsuit settlement and avoid federal prison." Victoria stared at me, her eyes wide with shock. $100,000? Elena, the land was appraised at $8 million. You are offering us a fraction of a penny on the dollar. "I am offering you exactly what you offered me for my life's work," I said, my voice dropping into a cold, lethal register that left no room for negotiation. "I am offering you the exact valuation you placed on my blood, sweat, and tears. You priced the earth at $100,000, Victoria. I am simply accepting your market value." "It's extortion," Greg hissed, though the fire in his voice was completely extinguished. It was the weak, hollow protest of a man who knows he has absolutely no leverage. "It's not extortion, Greg. It's a liquidity event. I smiled, using his own arrogant buzzword against him. You have 24 hours to decide. If you do not sign this deed by tomorrow morning, I will let the bank foreclose on the property. I will let the USDA levy the spoliation fines against you personally. And when the bank puts the quarantined land up for auction, I will simply buy it from them for pennies, and you will still go to federal prison for the unresolved IP violations. I picked up the pen and held it out toward him. You can take the $100,000 or you can take the felony, I said softly. But either way, you are leaving my valley. The silence in the mudroom was absolute. It was the heavy, undeniable gravity of a perfectly executed checkmate. Greg didn't argue. He didn't yell. He looked at the quitclaim deed, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the paper. He understood the brutal, flawless reality of the trap. I wasn't just taking the land. I was forcing him to legally document his own total, devastating defeat. He took the pen. He signed his name on the execution line. He handed the pen to Victoria. She didn't even read the document. She just wept, quiet, broken tears streaming down her face as she signed away her massive inheritance for the cost of a luxury car. I pushed a copy of the fully executed deed toward them, along with a certified cashier's check for $100,000. Make sure you have all your personal belongings out of the old farmhouse by the end of the week, I told them, picking up my copy of the deed and sliding it into my folder. I have a demolition crew coming on Monday. I'm tearing the old house down to expand my greenhouses. They didn't say another word. They turned and walked out of my research facility, stepping out into the freezing winter wind. They got into Greg's cheap, rented sedan and drove away down the dirt road. I stood in the doorway, watching the taillights fade into the distance. The valley was silent. The air was clean. The transaction was complete. The recovery of the estate was incredibly swift. With the biological assets back in the hands of the legal patent holder, Dr. Thorne and the USDA immediately lifted the federal agricultural injunction. I tore down my father's old drafty farmhouse. I didn't want the memories of his arrogance polluting the soil. I used the massive influx of capital from my international licensing deals to build a sprawling, state-of-the-art agricultural research complex. I transformed the 200 acres. The 50-acre Rostova Crimson Orchard became the mother block for a global distribution network. I planted the remaining 150 acres with new, experimental, drought-resistant hybrids. I hired a team of brilliant, dedicated agronomists and botanists who shared my reverence for the microscopic architecture of life. We didn't grow commodity corn. We grew the future of sustainable agriculture. I heard through mutual contacts that Greg and Victoria used the $100,000 to narrowly avoid a federal indictment. They paid off the furious resort developers and settled their bankruptcy. They are currently living in a small rented apartment in a dismal suburb. Victoria works as a receptionist at a mid-tier real estate firm, answering phones for people who possess the career she threw away. Greg is a project manager for a minor landscaping company. He spends his days planting decorative shrubs for wealthy homeowners. They thought they were apex predators, but they were nothing more than invasive weeds. Once they were pulled from the soil, they had no foundation to sustain themselves. I, however, have deep roots. I wake up every morning before the sun crests the valley ridge. I walk through the rows of my orchard. I feel the soil crunch beneath my boots. I inspect the blossoms. I test the irrigation lines. And I breathe in the sharp, clean scent of the earth. I am surrounded by a multi-million-dollar empire that I built entirely from the ground up, utilizing the very dirt my family told me was dead. People ask me sometimes if I feel vindictive. They ask if I enjoy knowing that my sister and brother-in-law lost millions of dollars and their social standing because I refused to share my success with them. I always give them the exact same answer. I didn't destroy their lives, I didn't falsify documents, and I didn't break the law. My sister and her husband destroyed themselves through their own profound, breathtaking ignorance. They looked at a masterpiece of cellular biology and only saw the dirt it was planted in. They believed that because they were loud, aggressive, and wore expensive suits, they were inherently smarter than the quiet woman standing in a greenhouse with a microscope. They assumed my boundaries were weak because I didn't scream or throw tantrums. They didn't realize that in agricultural science, the strongest defenses are the ones you can't see. A root system is completely invisible above ground, but it can shatter solid concrete if given enough time and pressure. I didn't set a trap. I simply handed them the exact physical object they demanded, and I let their own arrogance snap the jaws shut. You cannot pave over a foundation that is stronger than your machinery. You cannot steal intellectual property by bulldozing the physical housing, and you can never, ever expect a master builder to surrender the soul of their life's work just to subsidize your incompetence. That is my story. A $22 million real estate deal, 2,000 patented trees, and the exact moment a family of cheap corporate sharks realized they had tried to bulldoze the wrong geneticist. If you are the person in your life whose expertise is constantly minimized, whose quiet focus is mistaken for weakness, and whose boundaries are treated as mere suggestions by loud, arrogant people, take this as your absolute vindication. Do not yell at them. Do not try to explain the complexity of your work to people who only understand the surface. Quietly secure your root system, extract your true value, and let them seize the empty dirt. Thank you for spending your time with me today. If this story reminded you to always protect the roots of your life and to never let anyone else dictate your worth, please share it with someone who needs the strength to hold their ground. Drop a comment below with the word cultivated to let me know you stayed until the final harvest. Hit that subscribe button for more true stories about quiet victories, and I will see you in the next drama story.